Last week, Darkrai Magnezone had the best week one performance we've had in Pokemon Pocket's brief history to date. That being said, it came up quite a bit short during our second week's worth of tournaments. Let's go ahead and dive on into our full meta report, talking about what's working, what's not, and why. Let's kick things off with the starting metagame distribution of the almost 3,000 competitors that played in Pocket's three largest tournaments this week. We can see Darkrai variations were the most popular, with the Magnezone, Weavile, and Greninja builds making up nearly 20% of the submitted decks. After Darkrai, Exeggutor EX was our second most popular card, represented in 13% of the submitted decks. Continuing on down, Charizard EX variations were 8.5%, Gyarados EX Greninja were 7%, fighting decks featuring Hitmonlee and Magnezone made up 6.5%, Palkia Vaporeon was 5%, and everything else was varying quantities less than this. Moving along to our performance metrics this week, there were three standout performers among our 270 deck list that had a 70% win rate or higher. Exeggutor EX variations are number one with a bullet, though. They expanded their starting 13% metagame distribution to a whopping 25% of these most successful deck lists. In second was Darkrai Greninja variations, going from 5.5% up to 9%. And in third, the fighting variations featuring Magnezone as their big attacker went from 6.5% all the way up to 10%. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we had three notable underperformers in this week's data. Gyarados EX Greninja shrunk from its starting 7% down to 6 among the top performing decks. Palkia Vaporeon variation shrunk from 5% down to 4, and Charizard EX variation shrunk from 8.5% down to just 6. The big story in this week's data, in my opinion, is how the metagame developed an organic way to check the standout performer from our first week. While the Darkrai Magnezone didn't have a negative performance overall this week, it wasn't positive either, which is an impressive swing after it had an almost 200% overperformance in last week's metrics. Looking at the matchup tables for the Darkrai Magnezone deck, it's easy to see what happened. Our three top performers this week, the Exeggutor variations, the Magnezone fighting decks, and Darkrai Greninja, all have incredibly strong matchups into Darkrai Magnezone, which really helped keep it in check. In fact, looking at the other popular decks, the Darkrai Magnezone deck does not have any that are incredibly favorable for it, with things like Charizard, Darkrai, Weavile, and Palkia only being a few percentage points in its favor overall. It's noteworthy that there weren't any big innovations or changes among the most successful Darkrai Magnezone decks this week. I'll be curious to see if that remains the case in the future, or if it's able to adapt in some way to improve its matchups against things like Exeggutor and Hitmonlee. Looking to the hot new Darkrai variation this week, Darkrai Greninja, this deck list looks to hide behind either a Druddigon or a Kangaskhan while it artilleries down your other Pokemon with 20 damage hits from its two namesakes. Looking at the matchup tables for this deck, it's easy to see why it was a standout performer this week. In addition to being incredibly favored against Darkrai Magnezone, it's also very good against Palkia and Charizard variations, and is pretty evenly matched into things like Gyarados Greninja. Its one standout weak matchup is the Exeggutor decks, which is probably why that archetype had such a strong performance this week. Our third Darkrai variation, Darkrai Weavile, had a middling performance for a reason as well. While it's strongly matched into Magnezone Hitmonlee decks and Gyarados Greninja, it's evenly or poorly matched against most of the other popular decks like Charizard, Darkrai Magnezone, Palkia, and Exeggutor EX variations. To offer some speculation, I would bet that while this deck's good draws are absolutely unbeatable, running people down when you Darkrai into Dawn into Weavile attack for 90 on your first turn, that's a lot of moving parts, and I would bet the consistency or average case scenario for this deck tends to not put out nearly that much damage. Moving along to our best performer this week, Exeggutor variations, it's worth noting that all the most successful builds are playing the full set of eggs as well as Pokemon communication to find them more consistently. They all also feature at least one copy of Celebi, and some folks are opting to play one copy of Mew as well, likely to help hedge the Charizard matchup. Speaking of that, this deck list is kind of the thing that breaks all the new toys while losing to the old ones. It has incredibly strong matchups against all three Darkrai variations, as well as Palkia and Fighting decks, while it really struggles against both Charizard and Gyarados Greninja, two of the best decks from the last season. Hitmonlee Fighting variations have felt like they've been looking for their perfect finisher, and Magnezone is looking like it's setting itself up to be exactly that. In particular, Magnezone both hits for a lot of damage, is good when going first, and only offers up one knockout point when it gets cleared, letting it synergize cleanly with Marshadow, while Hitmonlee is able to soften up the things in the format that have 140 plus health to get them into single shot range for the Magnezone. As far as matchups go, this archetype is looking like it's going to have some of the most polarized this season. It has 60, 70, and even 80% matchups in its favor against things that are stalling like Gyarados Greninja, Charizard, and Darkrai Magnezone. However, the pendulum also swings hard in the other direction, with this deck list being only 20 or 40% into things like Exeggutor and Palkia decks. Dialga EX isn't breaking any records, at a fairly weak performance overall during the first week of our format, and during the second week, a lot of the builds have mostly disappeared. The Yanmega Dialga variation being the most popular and successful, taking its starting 2% metagame share to 2% of our top performers, meaning that while I wouldn't recommend this deck in terms of pure power level, if you enjoy playing this metal monster, it seems pretty reasonable and competitive. The tools it has allow it to keep up with a lot of the decks in the format, especially if you have first energy advantage. Yanmega clears things like Weavile and Darkrai quite efficiently, while Mew gives you counterplay into the bigger hitters like Charizard. Palkia Vaporeon list came up quite a bit short this week with a negative performance delta overall. Looking at their matchup tables, they did at least have strong performances against both Charizard as well as the Hitmonlee Magnezone decks, but they came up short in most other places, being a dog against all three Darkrai variations, really struggling against Exeggutor, and being relatively even against Gyarados Greninja. Based on how these numbers look, I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of the archetypes that has the most innovation possible for it looking into future weeks. During the first week's worth of metrics, this Vaporeon build was definitely a standout, but with it coming up quite a bit short here, I think it's probably worth exploring other pairings for Manaphy and Palkia. Finally, looking at Charizard as well as Gyarados Greninja variations, we see similar stories with these two archetypes. They both excel at beating up the Exeggutor decks that have been increasing in popularity and performance. They're evenly matched into each other, but they're struggling a lot into the various Darkrai decks, as well as the Hitmonlee Magnezone that's becoming more popular as well. One noteworthy tidbit this week from the Charizard matchup table is the fact that Charizard won 76% of the time against Exeggutor variations not playing Mew, while it only won 59% of the time against people electing to play a singleton copy of that counter EX card. So while Mew isn't enough for Exeggutor decks to fully flip the script in this difficult matchup, it gave them nearly 20 percentage points, taking it from practically unwinnable to something that can be much closer. Before we make it to our wrap-up this week, I'd like to take a quick minute to talk about the 18-trainer Pachirisu deck, because I had a lot of people mention this one on my EX tier list video from last week. I'll link that in the video description down below in case you missed it. Essentially, you'll note that this deck list was absent from both the starting metagame distribution as well as top performers in this video, and that's not an oversight. I only look at the largest Pokemon Pocket tournaments in a given week, because longer tournaments means decks that are less consistent are far less likely to put up a result. So while this Pachirisu variation put up some strong finishes in the smaller, shorter tournaments that happened over the course of the week, it came up quite a bit short in our most competitive events. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think part of it is the fact that this deck gets absolutely stomped by the Exeggutor variations, but also it's very one-dimensional and a one-trick deck, which means it's either going to win hard or lose hard. It's also a deck that's very bad when you don't have first energy advantage a lot of the time, meaning 50% of the games you play, you're going to be at a pretty distinct disadvantage. While I think it's possible that we'll see an 18 trainer deck that's good at some point in the future, this deck list really doesn't look like it's going to be the first as of yet. Digging into the second week of tournament data makes me more excited than ever to keep exploring Pokemon Pocket in competitive settings. It feels like the designers have done a phenomenal job of making sure that there is key counterplay to every powerful thing you can be doing in this metagame. It feels like, unless there's something brand new that we've all missed waiting to be discovered, we're going to settle into another format during the Space-Time Smackdown expansion where there are no S-tier decks, but instead a huge range of powerful things you can be doing, but also powerful things that let you keep up with them in a variety of different ways. If you're looking for the next breakout deck, perhaps, though, make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you don't miss tomorrow morning's Monday new deck review, where I'll be digging through those almost 3,000 deck lists played in tournaments this week and highlighting the most interesting ones that had strong performances. If you enjoyed my data-driven breakdown in this video, make sure you smash that like button as well. This meta report is a repeating feature on this channel every week, and we'd love to see you back again sometime. I really appreciate the folks that made it all the way through to the end of today's video, and I hope your next pack is an excellent one.